Hi everybody, hope you're doing alright considering the global pandemic going on. We have a lot to cover, so let's just get right in. So what our group was looking at is judgments of credibility of fake news in a social media context. So what do I mean when I'm talking about fake news? Well, it could just be referred to as lying, but there's a new contemporary understanding of what fake news is, and it's presently described as any form of news that is in some way deceptive, misinformed, or propaganda-like in nature, and is mass circulated across not only classic news media like print and broadcast, but now most pertinently on social media across the internet. So different meta-analyses have defined different types of fake news, those being satire, parody, fabrication, manipulation, advertising, and propaganda. We're most interested in fabrication, manipulation, and propaganda. So when we're talking about fake news, it's probably conjuring images of Donald Trump calling real news fake and fake news real. This issue Wardle refers to as information pollution, and she claims that this in itself creates three distinct issues, those being misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. We are most interested in disinformation when looking at propaganda type fake news. So what we're really getting at is fake news in a post-truth digital era, and what that means is post-truth being that there's information pollution clouding what information is true and what's not, and digital era just being that it's happening on the internet. So the internet being used to disperse fake news has very unique issues, those being first off the anonymity of users and what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve by spreading any news. There's also the social media platforms algorithms which are used to advertise content to users. They're quite vulnerable to fake news being spread because of the way they work. They advertise the most interacted with content as the best content, and when looking at how bots and AI play into the current usage of fake news, that can become a large issue. The last point is that there's a current lack of safeguards to prevent fake news from being spread on social media platforms. So there's no way for a social media platform to distinguish what news is fake and what is real, and it's up to human users to judge the credibility of any news that they see. So bots and AI can simply be defined as bots as a software application that runs automated tasks over the internet, and AI as computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence, etc. So an AI is typically created by what's known as a handler, somebody who programs it and trains it on a certain thing, such as pretending to be a human user. And this can be used to create bots en masse who can masquerade as human users and push agendas. And when there's a bunch of bots creating all of this fake news content, they can create these fake pages, and because there can be tens of thousands of bots interacting with a page, all posting fake news or interacting with fake news, this can get into the algorithm and make a social media platform think that this is good content that should be advertised to users just because it's being interacted with so much. It's also important to note that you can pay for ad space or pay to extend the reach of your content. So this is important when we're looking at these statistics, that 76% of US adults consistently return to familiar news sources. Of that percentage, 51% claim loyalty to said news sources. Also, 62% of Americans consume their news content from social media alone, and of that percentage, 66% purely use Facebook, which has been known to have the weakest algorithm in terms of being vulnerable to fake news algorithm abuse. So this can get people caught in what's known as a filter bubble, where if they interact with a fake news page or an AI or a bot run page, then they will start to be advertised more and more fake news pages, and it will lead into this loop where the only news they're getting is fake, and that can lead to confirmation bias and belief perseverance effect. So what we're looking at is the future implications of how AI can affect fake news on social media. So currently there is certain algorithms and AI that are able to generate fake news articles that are relatively convincing and basically need no input from a handler. And what we're looking at in our experiment is if we can prime participants to judge credibility of fake news on three different conditions, that being real news articles, fake news articles that have been made by a real person, and fake news articles that have been generated by an AI. So what I'm going to show you in the next section is how easy it is to make a piece of fake news with an AI and how believable it can be. So what we did in our experiment was basically create fake news using this algorithm called Grover. All we had to do was put in a news source for it to take a writing style and then a prompt, in this one being the coronavirus. And then we would take that AI generated article and edit the HTML of an actual New York Times article or whichever news outlet we're looking at to create a fake article that would look normal otherwise.
To inform the future experiment, a scoping survey was circulated amongst the general student population. The data from this survey, as shown here, informed the creation of the experimental questionnaire, as well as brought to light 5 areas of interest in article gathering, namely health, sports, politics, entertainment, and technology. When gathering these articles, both normal online keyword searches as well as keyword searches on fact-checking websites were used to find real and fake or disproven articles, respectively. The experiment itself took place across 2 separate sessions, the first involving a focus group which centered on general themes relating to the research, but with the focus of credibility and fake news not emphasized, to allow for an unprimed first experimental session. After the conclusion of the first focus group, the experiment was administered as a computerized task, in which participants were asked to react to a generated Facebook feed and afterwards respond to a questionnaire regarding credibility. The first condition involved the participants viewing the feed with no knowledge of the presence of fake news in the study. Once the first condition concluded, the participants were asked to complete another task which followed the same structure as the first, the main difference being their knowledge of the presence of fake articles. The final part of the study involved a second focus group 1 week after the administration of the first session. The second focus group centered more directly on the topics of the study, as well as reactions and thoughts on the study content. The results of the experiment have been divided into sections of qualitative and quantitative value. For the questionnaire data, quantitative analysis was run. Repeated measures, 2 by 3 ANOVA, was run on the data with the IVs of knowledge, with its levels of informed versus uninformed, and article type, with its levels of real, fake, and bot articles. This analysis found there to be no significant difference between the conditions, but significant differences between the article types and in the interaction. Descriptive statistics were run on the data and used to inform further analysis, as shown in this graph. It was assumed that the likely location was related to the real or fake articles in the second condition. The post-hoc tests on the run of the data showed that this was the case. All tests found the same result, showing that in the first condition there was no significant differences, but that in the second condition, while the real and bot articles were not significantly different, there was a significant difference between the real-fake article responses and both of the other article types.
Our qualitative results were data-driven and aimed to collect information from 3 separate stages of our research. These were our first and second focus groups, as well as the experiment's questionnaire through open-ended questions. These covered topics of credibility of fake news, as well as social media participation and perceptions more generally. The first focus group was aiming to obtain a general overview of participants' awareness and interactions with social media. A common trend that emerged was a lack of knowledge surrounding algorithms, privacy, and external data use, and an anxiety and a sense of being overwhelmed was commonly reported as well. Despite these negative feelings, people reported a fear of missing out that drove them to continue to participate in social media. Another theme that emerged was a constructed image in which participants reported a fear of being judged and a tendency to filter images and cultivate an online persona. The final theme that emerged was private sharing, which participants suggested they felt more comfortable sharing news and posts through private messaging or restricted profiles such as Finstance. The questionnaire asked questions on perceived credibility of each article and the features that led them to this conclusion. 6 main themes emerged: source, appearance, topic knowledge, quality of evidence, context, and interest. Across all conditions, content was the largest determinant of credibility before priming, and participants tended to believe topics they perceived as logical and justifiable. Notably, after being primed to look for fake news, participants adopted a different detection strategy and paid greater attention to the quality of the evidence provided. Credibility of the source also increased as a feature used in detection, while personal interest in the topic became less salient to participants detecting credibility. Topic knowledge and judgments of the source's appearance remained constant, suggesting that once an article is deemed less credible due to unsuitable language or sensational headlines, they were quickly dismissed regardless of the supporting evidence. From the second focus group, 5 themes emerged as key points of discussion. These were experimental impact, defining fake news, detection techniques, desirable features, and an inability to discriminate. Participants tended to express a decrease in motivation as the experiment went on, resulting in decreased fact-checking and concentration, which may be reflective of exposure to large amounts of news on one's feed. Furthermore, with regards to experimental impact, severe implications of news articles were the ones that resulted in an increased likelihood of being disseminated to others. Detection techniques discussed included the use of headlines and increased fact-checking for personal topics of interest, but that was reported they wouldn't go much further than a Google search. Defining fake news included features such as an intent to mislead and a strong bias. Participants shared key features of news articles that would encourage classification as credible, and these included clear and concise writing style, good author and publisher reputations, and scientific topics. Self-reported inability to discriminate emerged as a theme, with participants reporting confirmation bias as they question news which is more in line with their beliefs less than the opposing evidence. For the purpose of this presentation, we have handpicked an example of some of the quotations from participants in the second focus group, which enable our audience to gain a greater understanding of the context behind our coding frame. These particular quotes stress the need for interventions and training to support healthy development of analytical skills and detection when exposed to fake news sources on social media.
Hey everyone, so I will be running through the discussion of our results, some of our own limitations, some of the group dynamics that we found during the project, and finally the recommendations that we will put forward from this research. So, as a jumping off point, I'm going to look at the quantitative data. As Graham mentioned, the main finding from our analysis of variance was there was a statistically significant difference between the before and after conditions in discerning articles that had been published but were later shown to be fake. So why is this important? Well, there was no statistical significant difference between the articles that were AI generated in the before and after condition, nor was there any difference in the real articles. There was an improvement in the ability to discern those articles that exist in the real world as fake news, and they were better able to discern those articles from the AI generated articles and from the real articles. And that is where the statistical significance lay. So what does this mean? Interrogating it a little bit more with the qualitative data. Well, from the questionnaire, we saw that in the before condition, participants would often believe articles that fit into their worldview. They would read the title, they would briefly read over what the content was, but they wouldn't look at it in any detail. They thought, okay, well, this is similar to what I already know, I will believe it. Once they are made aware of the presence of fake news, participants would read the articles more carefully. They would interrogate what was there and they would look closely at what was being said. So even if something seemed initially contrary to what they might think or believe, they would read it and see if they could be convinced by it. Another big aspect that would convince participants, more so in after condition than before condition, was source. Now, this is very important in explaining our data. When we were generating the AI articles, we would put fake versions of very mainstream websites on it. We're talking about the BBC, the Guardian, the New York Times, articles that were publishing articles that were later disproven as being fake news would often come from smaller news outlets. This could be the reason that participants were not able to discern the AI generated articles. So again, looking at the qualitative data to try and unpack this a little bit more, what did we find from the first focus group? We found that the definition of news needs to be challenged. Participants would often talk about news in relation to things that their friends had posted versus things that news outlets were posting. Sharing of missing persons came up a few times in terms of whether this should be believed or not. This is really challenging what the definition of news is. Equally, how news is being spread was huge. So participants talked about spreading news on WhatsApp, they talked about private messaging it, they talked about sharing on their stories. This is so important because we're not just talking about a Facebook feed as we investigated, but we're talking about news in many different aspects. Now, our scoping survey had hinted towards this, with Instagram actually being the main social media platform by a significant number. Facebook came second. Now, the reason we chose to run with Facebook rather than Instagram is Instagram was too difficult to generate a fake news feed for testing. That said, if other researchers have more time and resources, Instagram is definitely an avenue worth pursuing. Now, another classic issue in psychology is that difference between self-report and actual behavior. Students would often say, no, I don't use Facebook, Facebook is dead, Facebook is for our parents, but then if brought up, where do you get your news? They would answer, Facebook. Finally, what drives participants to look at news on social media is this fear of missing out. Participants were not interested in acquiring the truth, in acquiring this real news, but instead were more worried about missing out, about being the one in their group not to have seen something. This driver could be really important at conducting further research for why participants are looking at the Facebook feed. Maybe they don't care about fake news as much as we might initially speculate. Then our qualitative data from the second focus group, this is the one that was carried afterwards. The main takeaway we took from it was that participants were surprised by how bad they were at judging an article's credibility. Even the questionnaire asked before and after the experiment, and it went down from just under 2.8 down to 2.5, a statistically significant difference on a Likert scale measured from 1 to 4. If this Likert scale was larger, it would be possible that gap would also be larger, but that is speculation and worth investigating. It does highlight, though, that reminding participants that credibility is difficult to judge could be useful. So before we get on to recommendations, I'm going to run through some of our own limitations and how we found running this experiment. First of all, there were 10 of us, which is a large number of experimenters to have for the purpose of this experiment. We did find it difficult at times, but we managed to make it work. We each had our own area of interest. That usually meant that we could divvy up the work in such a way that we're always working on something that personally interested us, which was very nice. There were some disagreements at times, particularly in regards to ecological validity, whether ecological validity was to be our highlight or a more theory-driven approach. We decided a vote would be the fairest way, but in the end we were meeting twice a week, and we, through discussion, were almost always able to come to a compromise. To be honest, technology has been our best friend throughout this. As you can see in this slide, this was our Facebook feed. We were able to use Facebook for it, even though we were shut down a few times by Facebook. We persevered and we managed to get a live Facebook feed. We felt this was important in getting as close to an ecologically valid experiment as possible, but there were some limitations. We had no comments below the articles, which many participants pointed out would be a way of figuring out whether an article was legitimate or not. For further research, it would be interesting to include a fabricated comments section. Equally, people highlighted that Facebook wasn't their platform of choice. WhatsApp, Instagram, others were important to them. And so our experiment was specifically looking at Facebook, and this is important to remember. Finally, of course, there were some limitations due to the coronavirus, as there has been across the board. We used Google Hangouts in order to keep meeting twice a week, and we managed to carry forward, and we're happy with our concluded analysis and our recommendations. So what are these recommendations? Well, first of all, platform must always be remembered is that we investigated Facebook, and this isn't applied across the board. maybe it would also apply to WhatsApp, maybe it would apply to Instagram, but this can't be assumed. We found that how you interact with these different platforms was very, very different from the qualitative analysis. We saw during the coronavirus that the proliferation of fake news on WhatsApp was horrendous, even addressed by Taoiseach Leo Varadkar that this had to stop. But when interrogating this type of information, we investigated Facebook, and our findings are applicable to Facebook. For Facebook, we would highlight to make the source very clear. This is very important. If it's from the BBC, it's from the Guardian, highlight this for users. Equally, just being made aware of the presence of fake news seems to help a lot. And our class provided to university students upon entering university would have the potential to really help interrogate fake news in their social media feeds, telling them to check the source, to question the intention of the source, to interrogate the content, and beyond whether it just fits into your pre-designed world view, could really, really help cut down on the presence of fake news, in our opinion. Equally, when designing these recommendations, we again have to remember platform specific when further research is conducted, to remember that each platform is different, users interact with it differently, and that self-report can't be the basis of how users interact with this. You need to test them in an experimental environment to see how they interact with it in a genuine circumstance as much as possible. So that is the crux of our recommendations. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask, and thank you so much for listening.